Hi, welcome back to Adopted into Christ. My name is Kia Harris, and this is part 3 of this 4-part series on my testimony. So, if you are new here, welcome. And also, if you haven't watched part 1 and 2, I advise you to go back and watch those so you can get the details about my birth and then my childhood. And today we're going to be talking about my high school years, my teen years, and so I'm excited for that. But before we get into that, I wanted to do a follow-up to a statement I made in my last video when I expressed to you that God had healed me. He did a miracle in my life where He was able to grow my right leg back into even with my other one. And so I wanted to follow up on that statement. So I made a statement and I said that God can do a miracle today. And what I want to say to that is, yes, He can, but I also want to say that He is going to do it on His will and based on His timing. And so it's not going to be always instant. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some continued faith. And so I want to express that it may not be instant, but He is going to do it, and you have to believe it and continue to believe it and continue to believe for what you are asking Him for. And so I wanted to make that follow-up statement with you. So let's jump into my teen years in high school. So in high school, I was so reserved. I was reserved to the point where when people would talk to me and invite me to hang out with them or eat lunch with them, I would literally just say no, because I didn't want to put myself in situations that made me feel uncomfortable and awkward. And so I would prevent myself from those type of situations. And my way of preventing that would be to kind of shun someone and reject people. And that wasn't one of my goals. I was just really reserved and quiet and shy, and I didn't know anything about my identity yet and who I was. And so I just went away from things like that. But I did have friends. They still were able to be my friends even though I rejected them. And so that's a great thing. And I have a very good friend that I'm still friends with from high school, and so I'm just really grateful for her. Another thing is that I wanted to go to my sister's high school. We actually ended up going to different high schools because my family, my mother, my sister, and I, we moved. And my sister was already in high school close to where we were originally staying. And then when we moved, we were closer to another high school. And so I ended up going there, and it was much more convenient for me. Although I really wanted to go to my sister's high school, but my mother was like, no, because she knew how protective my sister was of me. And so she was like, this is the better choice. And I appreciate her for that, because going to that school was a good choice. And I was very effective there. So that was how I was, my demeanor during high school. I was very quiet, shy, and reserved. I was a very focused individual, driven, even though I was young. And so I was always focused on school and getting good grades and things like that. I also ran track. I ran track for a few years. I remember one year I took a break, and then I went back and I continued in track, and I was successful at that, really finding towards the end of my track years exactly what I was gifted in. And then I also ran cross country one year, and that was something, because cross country in Southern California, when the weather is 100 plus degrees in the summertime, was horrible for me, and I just really not enjoy it, but I think it kind of built up something in me. So those are my sports. I tried other things, but it just didn't work. I tried dance, and that was not my thing. And that kind of relates to the fact that we would jump into things not knowing, like, hey, this is your good fit, and no, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. So I guess that was just something I had to learn then. Also, I really, when you're in high school, you're like, oh, I'm so excited about the guys, and this is who I like. I like blank, whatever his name is, and you're so excited about these guys, and ironically, the guys that don't like you, you still pursue them, and then the guys that like you don't like them, and so you're going through this, like, cycle of liking guys and then not pursuing, getting pursued, and then just this whole cycle of whatever, just getting to know your feelings and your emotions towards the opposite sex, and not really knowing who you are, but wanting to be in a relationship because other people are in it. So I was in that stage. I wanted to be in a relationship. I never actually was in a relationship until college. which I had my first relationship then, but you know, I had guys that I liked in high school, and yeah, so I had those experiences, and I'm sure you had those experiences in high school. Maybe you're the popular kid. I wasn't the popular kid, but I was the smart kid, and so that's what I was known for. But whether you're considered to be the jock or whatever, I don't even know if they use that term anymore, or you were someone that was more quiet and reserved and kept themselves like me, doesn't matter where you were on that spectrum or are on that spectrum, you still have a purpose and you still have a calling. So another thing that I experienced when I was in high school is I would see white figures in my mother's room. So her room was across the way from my sister and I, our room, and I would see in my peripheral vision these white figures that were in her room, and she let me know that those are angels actually. And so that was an experience that I had, that I have been asking God, like, so can I do that again? Like, can I see angels again? But, you know, really in my plain sight. And so that's what I've been believing God for, to be able to see angels again, because I feel like that is such a gift. But as I've expressed in my past videos, the fact that I saw the opposite of angels, I've seen other things that weren't really what I wanted to see. And so, hoping not to see those things, but I do want to see angels, because I feel like that's just a powerful thing to do, and be able, a powerful gift to have from God. So let's jump into college. So in college, I applied to a few schools, and I really wanted to get into this one school, but I ended up not getting into that school. I believe you take the SAT, and you still take the SAT now, and I took the SAT and I did okay. I didn't do amazingly enough to get into the school that I wanted to get into. I did get into this other school that was a little bit closer to where I was staying, which was in Inland Empire, but I decided not to go to that school because their housing wasn't available, and so I went a little farther out, about an hour or so away from where I was living when I graduated high school, which was Corona, and then I was able to go to that school, and I loved it because I was able to have my independence. I was able to actually be my own self, whatever that meant. Although I was really young, I graduated when I was 17 years old, so I was 17 years old, already going to college and going out on my own and being in the dorm and having my first roommate and making friends, and then going clubbing and all those things that I felt I did because other people were doing. And I think often in college you do things when other people are doing them, not realizing like, hey, so you as a follower of Christ are set apart, which means you don't have to do the things that other people are doing. You don't have to drink, do drugs, and things like that. And so unfortunately I did involve myself in those kind of things, and I did go clubbing. Although the interesting thing is, when I went clubbing, I always made sure that I had all my studies together, and not to say that that makes it better, but I always felt when I was in the club, literally, that I should have been focusing on studying. Like I was always distracted from when I was in a club. I always felt like I was wasting my time. Another thing is just like, you go to clubs and you hope to meet these guys, and these guys are not going to be your husband, and then you waste your time doing that. And I mean, I think the point of going clubbing then, at least for me, was being noticed. Like, the highlight of going out was getting dressed up, and then when you were intoxicated, if I'm honest, you like to get that attention from other guys. And so that was kind of what I did, knowing that I shouldn't have been doing it, but I did it because everybody else was doing it, and I enjoyed it. I'm not going to lie about it. I did enjoy it at the time, but eventually I grew out of that, and I said, well, that's not my thing anymore. So that is what I did. I also started off in college being a bio major, and I was like, okay, so I'm going to be a physician assistant, which is a little lower ranking than a doctor, but they do have some type of authority, because I had in my mind, I do not want to go all the way with becoming a doctor. I don't want to go through all these school years of pursuing that. I don't want to take all those science courses, although I did end up in the end after college taking all those courses that would have led me to pursuing eventually becoming a physician, which I eventually did. But at that time I said, I didn't want to do that, so I switched my major to health science, and that allowed me to have this amazing professor who's actually still my mentor, who actually sits on my board of my organization, Dare Humanity, and I was able to do research under him, and he just opened up these doors to a lot of different things, and so that was just awesome. And so thoroughly am thankful that I changed my major because that was the direction I was supposed to go in. I also was in a relationship at that time but didn't work out. That's all I'm going to say about that. And then because I was a health science major, I volunteered at a few hospitals for a few years, did a couple internships, and had a couple leadership roles there. And so that was great. And I actually volunteered at the hospital that I was born at. So on my birth certificate, it says the hospital I was born at. And so I wanted to volunteer there. So I signed up to volunteer, and I ended up doing that for a couple years. So that was very interesting to be able to work at the hospital where I was actually born at. And the initiation of my adoption started. Also, I wanted to touch on some of the supernatural experiences that I experienced in college. And one of them was, so my father was staying in Ontario. He originally, when we were younger, we lived in Los Angeles, but when we got older, we were in high school, he moved to Ontario in order to be closer to us. So on weekends, eventually when I got my car, which was passed down to me, I was able to go on weekends to visit him in his house, and he had this garden, and we had our room that was set aside for us, and it was just nice to be able to go and visit him on weekends. And so he also had a girlfriend at the time, and she stayed with him, and one day she was cooking in the kitchen, and she was getting something from the pantry in the corner of the kitchen, and I saw this dark figure that was hovering over her. And I mentioned it to her, and she was like, oh, well, maybe that is my brother. And so I said, oh, okay. And then I don't know if it was that same night or a night that I spent there afterwards, but I was sleeping in this room. We call it the kickback room, which was basically a room for my dad to go in and basically watch games or whatever, or as a place for people to go and kind of just relax. And so in that kickback room, I had fell asleep on this bed that we had in there, and then I woke up and I looked at the space that was right next to the bed, and there was something there. And that something was this demon-like child that was staring at me, and I was terrified. And I remember, I think I closed my eyes, and then I immediately jumped up and grabbed the Bible that was in the room and started reading it because I had never seen anything like that before. And based on what happened in that household, there was a lot of strife. There was also a lot of arguments. That was probably the source of that being there. And so that was one of my experiences that I had where I saw that, and I was just immediately frightened. And yeah, that was just a wow experience for me. So that just goes to show that you should really be connected to God, because if you are able to see things like that, you know that you don't have to be frightened because you know that God is protecting you. And so I knew that I was protected. I knew to go to him to read the Bible, and so that I think having that knowledge was able to let me get out of that situation, let me not be fearful of that situation. So also, I have dreams. When I have dreams about people having babies, they will have babies. So I remember there's one dream I had where the daughter of a mother that was friends with my mom, the night before she revealed that she was having a boy, I had a dream that she had a boy. And so whenever I have dreams about people having kids, and I recently had a dream about my friend having a daughter, and she's been wanting a daughter, and so just waiting for that to happen. But usually when I have dreams about people having kids, like, you're going to have a kid. So that is another gift that I have in the prophetic. And then, so later in college, I moved into apartments in Long Beach because I was staying in the dorms for a couple years, and then I decided to move out with one of my roommates and have an apartment for myself and her. And so we moved into that apartment, and that was our transition into eventually moving out, and I moved back home after college. And another experience I want to talk about as I close this part of the series is that my father was sick at that time in college. During my later years in college, my father was sick. My sister was staying with them at the time, and she said that he ended up calling her one day and saying that you need to come home, and he had basically had a stroke, and she had to go home and pretty much take care of him. So my father was very prideful, and he did not like going to the doctors, and it was actually not until afterwards, after he kept on having different instances come up, that we were able to find out, like, okay, so he had diabetes, he had high blood pressure, he had all these different things that were part of his physical being that we had no idea about because he didn't tell us. He was also a chronic smoker and drinker, and also around that time, and I believe the reason for one of his strokes is that he lost his job. He was laid off, and so he was very stressed. He had a mortgage to cover. He had his daughters, my sister and I, to cover, and so he became very stressed. He would apply to jobs, and they would not hire him because of most likely his older age, but he would still be persistent about it. So after that first stroke, he was able to recover, but then he ended up having multiple strokes. And I remember one weekend I was sitting on the couch, and he was going outside, and he grabbed the door, and he was kind of like, how do you describe it? He was kind of twitching, like, kind of when you repeat an action, he was doing that. He kept on repeating, opening the door, and I knew that was the point where everything had changed. His whole demeanor had changed. He wasn't as lively anymore. He wouldn't eat as often. He wasn't the daddy that I knew before. And so that was a very hard time for me. And I remember this other time where because he was a smoker, he had the habit of smoking, but after he had the strokes, he didn't know how to light the cigarette anymore, and so he would go outside in like the action of going to light a cigarette, but not actually be able to light it. He also wasn't able to walk anymore, and I remember one time I had to get the computer chair to push him to his room so he could get in the bed. And that was just a really hard time for me, and I had to make sure that I tried to get out to Ontario on weekends to be able to see him more often, because after that his condition continued to plummet, and eventually he ended up in the ICU, and eventually he was not able to breathe on his own, and he went through that for years. He was on life support for years, and a part of this was because my sister and I couldn't let go. We couldn't let go of the fact that our daddy was not going to be the man he was anymore, and that he wasn't going to be there anymore, and so we had him on life support for years, and that was something, I mean, when you're in that situation, it's just so difficult to move past it and let go of a person. And so we were young, and we were, having hopes, although the doctor said that he had no brain activity. And so I went through a very hard time at that point. My sister and I went through a lot at that point, and it was great that we were able to support each other. But I went through a series of depression. I was really depressed. I was so depressed that I was asking God to take my life instead. And I spent nights crying and hoping that God would just reverse his condition and bring him out of that. But I didn't know that it wasn't his will to do that. I didn't know that God wanted him to go home and go into heaven. And my father was not a Christian, and we prayed that he was able to accept Christ into his heart. I think he grew up in a Christian household, but he didn't live a lifestyle according to the word. And so we knew afterwards that he was able to accept Christ, and that now he's in heaven and we'll be able to see him again. But during that period, I was very depressed. I walked around with a cloud over my head. I was very emotional. Like when you lose a parent or